Well, I want to talk today about Romans 13 and a Christian's responsibility and relationship with the government. The problem is that I don't exactly know how to do this without reading what I've prepared, because I can't just talk extemporaneously off the top of my head. I know people do that on YouTube all the time, and when I watch them, I go, how do they do that? How do they just talk for 45 minutes and not have any notes in front of them? And so I have notes in front of me, and I'm sorry, I just have to read what I'm going to say, or else I'm going to blow it. So that's just a disclaimer at the beginning. So Romans 13, just in case you don't have time to listen to the whole thing and you want some of my summary, here are some of my salient points right at the beginning. That Romans 13 is only one of many biblical texts that talk about a Christian's relationship to the government. And so we take it for what it says. It's the inspired word of God. We pay attention to it. It's very important. But there's more to the picture than what Romans 13 and Romans 13:1 gives us. We follow the whole counsel of God, not just one piece. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that what Romans 13 is saying, and other texts say as well, is that the idea of government is God's idea. But that doesn't mean that God is responsible for every governmental leader who is in power, that he has placed every person in authority who is in that position. We owe to Caesar only what belongs to Caesar. Third thing, when we are deciding how to act in the face of any particular governmental interaction, there are several alternatives that are available to us as believers. We are not locked into a one-size-fits-all pattern. And so there is no mandatory list that I can give you or that anybody can give you that we have to follow every time. It's just not that kind of a situation. Which leads us to the fourth thing, is that we really have to follow the guidance of the Holy Spirit if we're to walk in the Spirit with regard to these matters. And we have to consult with God as we decide how best to interact with any particular governmental idea or authority. So let's look at Romans 13, 1-7. People are struggling right now with whether to comply with what the government is telling us to do or whether to resist it. And you can find Christians on both sides of the fence. Some who just say, let's just stay home, let's keep the country healthy until this thing passes, do what the government is telling you to do. Versus the idea that the stay-at-home order is going to bring the whole country down for years, and the government is taking away our rights, they are infringing on our rights, and we need to stand up. So I know the evidence is still new about what corona is and how it works, and there are large disagreements about what it is and how it works. Several states are open, and the case curve hasn't necessarily changed, even though it's always in flux. So Christians are arguing with each other as to how best and how in a most godly way to handle this situation. So we're hearing more about Romans 13 all the time, more than we've heard in years, even though we always hear about Romans 13. But Romans 13 is not the only text in the Bible that tells us how Christians relate to the government. So let's talk about that. The first thing to remember is that Paul did not write in chapters and verses. Paul just wrote a letter. It's a straight flow of thought. And so what comes immediately before this serves as both a conclusion to the previous section as well as an introduction to this section. And so we have to pay attention with what goes directly before this. And what Paul directly said before Romans 13:1 is, don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And so we see that verse as a setup to what he's saying in Romans 13. At the beginning of that section, he also said, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. The whole preceding section to Romans 13 is a section about conforming our minds to the way God thinks, to living moral lives in the midst of our neighbors, living redemptively in community, to expect suffering, at the hands of our enemies. And then he ends that section with, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And hey, since I'm thinking about that thought, let's talk about our relationship with the government. See, that's Paul's flow. We usually start at Romans 13:1, and we're not looking at the sentence right before it. So this statement, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good, is what Paul is going to talk about when he's talking about a Christian's relationship to the government. Why? Because the government is so often prone to evil. And our primary role in relation to it is our godliness and how we are overcoming evil with goodness. So remember, never forget that. That's really what Paul's point is talking about. Our primary place, according to Romans 12, is to see our position towards the government as an expression of suffering with the sufferings that Christ himself suffered. That servanthood should follow Christ's model, that we should have concern for the weaker brother more than concern for ourselves, and that we should be abounding in love. These are the points, the talking points, that frame up Paul's entire conversation about the government in Romans 13. And we have to keep that in mind for the whole discussion. Now, when Paul wrote this, Nero was the emperor. It was about AD 57 when he wrote it. Nero was still a good emperor at the time. He was about 19 years old at that time. And so also remember that this letter and this chapter were written to the Romans themselves. This is Romans 13. It was written to the Christians who lived in Rome, right around the vicinity of Nero and the immediate impact of anything that the Roman Empire did. Now, in those days, the emperor was considered to be divine, though somewhat useless in actually running the empire. The government didn't stop civil wars. It sometimes started them for its own purposes. There's no good reason to let a good crisis go to waste. Rome couldn't make anyone obey. What Rome could do was tax people and crucify them if they disobeyed. So other than that, it tried to keep the population passive and the economy humming. So how's Paul going to talk to his Roman audience about the government? And what Paul is saying is, let's overcome evil with good. Let's have the Christians be the orderly part of this empire, and maybe the only orderly part of this empire. The best path to sharing Christ, the best path to fulfilling the Great Commission, is sharing Christ and bringing people to the kingdom by being orderly citizens. That was Paul's point in Romans 13. Let's take it a verse at a time. So Romans 13:1 says, everyone must submit himself to governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God, unquote. So this means a lot of things, and it deserves some careful attention. First of all, it means that God distributes the exercise of power to human agents. He delegates government authority to people. Government is God's idea. That's what Paul is saying. Government is God's idea for the purpose of maintaining moral order. It does not say, however, that God has put every ruler in place. This is not an issue of divine right, where any ruler can say, God put me here. There is no mention here that every governmental ruler has divine right, or that every governmental person was put in their position by God. It does not say that. It means instead that government is God's idea and that we have human rulers. That's what the verse is talking about. What many people don't realize is when Paul uses the term submit in verse 1, he's using military vocabulary in a somewhat military context. Now, so we should look at what he's talking about when he talks about submit. We should think of it more in terms of soldierly duty than brainless and idle submission like sheep. Soldiers were respected, and when they were good soldiers, they were rewarded. They were expected to comply and to submit. But it's soldierly duty, not sheep-like submission. He was, in effect, urging Christians to become stakeholders in the nation, just like stockholders in a company. This is our country, and we should care about it like it's ours. This country does not belong to the king or to the emperor. It belongs to us. And we lead through servanthood, which is something that Jesus talked about as well. You know, when it says, "For there is no authority except that which God has established," the authorities that exist have been established by God. Again, it is not saying that every king has divine right, but only that order is better than chaos. Order is better than anarchy, right? Nor does he oppose here the legitimacy of revolution for change. That's not here. What he opposes is anarchy, lawlessness, and disorder. And that's what he's saying, that God has established government because God establishes order. Chuck Colson said, quote, "The state serves a divinely appointed and divinely defined task, although it is not in itself divine." And that's an important point, unquote. That's an important point. So the text does not affirm, therefore, that God has ordained every leader or that God has ordained every particular government. It is not saying that each individual ruler has been put there by God. By saying that, you'd be saying that every ruler has God's stamp of moral approval, and we know that's not the case. So that can't be what the text is saying. What is ordained is the concept of government. John Yoder, in a book called The Politics of Jesus, writes, quote, "As long as a given government lives up to a certain minimum set of requirements, then that government may properly claim the sanction of divine institution. If, however, the government fails adequately to fulfill the functions divinely assigned to it, it loses its authority. It then becomes the duty of the preacher and the prophet to teach that this has become an unjust government, worthy of rebellion. It can become the duty of Christian citizens to rise up against it, not because they are against government, but because they are in favor of proper government," unquote. Now, the concept of just rebellion is sometimes a moral obligation. This understanding was taught by notables such as Zwingli, John Calvin, and plenty of others. So let's continue on. Romans 13:2. "Consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves." Now, it doesn't say he who rebels against the king or he who rebels against the president, but he who rebels against authority. Remember that Paul's point is overcome evil with good. That's the context. But we also have to remember that this is not the Bible's only statement about the relationship with the government of the people, and that's some of what I want to look at now. What else does the Bible say about the way we relate to government? In Exodus 1, verses 15 to 21, we see that the midwives disobeyed Pharaoh. This was government-sponsored Planned Parenthood. It was infanticide. And the midwives had no problem with being civilly disobedient. They wouldn't violate God's law, and so they disobeyed Pharaoh's law and then even lied about it. In Joshua chapter 2, verses 1 through 6 and 15, Rahab defied the government and refused to give up the Israelite spies to the authorities, and she even lied about it. She was obeying a higher law. Daniel 3. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego defied the king's orders and refused to bow down. Now, notice they disobeyed the law, but they didn't resist the punishment that came with that. They said, we understand we're going to be punished for this disobedience, but we will not bow down to the king. And they didn't protect themselves from the penalty. That was God's job. Daniel chapter 6, verses 10 to 13. Daniel intentionally broke the law in direct defiance of the king's edict. Again, he was obeying a higher law. Matthew chapter 2, verses 7 and 8. The Magi, the wise men, at the Christmas story. Herod ordered them to report back. God ordered them to disobey Herod. And they chose to disobey the king, and they went back to their country by a different route. Acts chapter 4, verses 19 and 20. Peter and John were ordered not to preach. Jesus had ordered them to preach. They chose to obey God instead of the government. Acts chapter 16. Paul and Silas were thrown into jail. After the earthquake and their miraculous release, they were ordered to leave town. Instead, they staged a sit-in. But what was the issue? The issue was they were being forbidden to preach the gospel. And they said that was a violation of Paul's right of free speech as a Roman citizen. So he refused to obey the government because it was infringing on his rights. His constitutional rights, so to speak, were being violated. In other words, there are biblical, legitimate justifications for rising up against the government and disobeying what they say to do. Now, a long quote. Let me give you a long quote from the opening paragraphs of the United States Declaration of Independence. Of course, you can go online and read these at your will, but let me just read a long paragraph right from the beginning. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth and separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind require that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. And then the declaration goes on from there. Now, these paragraphs are very biblical. Let's look at Romans 13:3. We'll keep going through Romans. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and he will commend you. In other words, God instituted the idea of government to enable society to do what is right. From Proverbs 20, verse 8, and Romans 13, 3 and 4, right where we are, we learn that the point of government is to maintain morality and justice in society. We can judge and measure the extent to which a government is accomplishing its ministry by asking whether it is treating good as good and evil as evil. In Isaiah 1, God condemns the government that exalts self-preservation and the exercise of power over both justice and fairness for all. A government that has turned right and wrong on its head, or that is acting out of injustice, should be opposed, according to Isaiah 1, because God condemns such a government, according to Isaiah chapter 1. The authority of any particular government is not self-justifying. That government exists is ordered by God. But the text doesn't say that whatever government does or asks of its citizens is good. And we as Christians can't possibly claim that God is saying that everything a government asks is good and we should submit to it. We all know better than that. We should be submissive to the authority of government. But if we simply obey anything any governmental official says, we are relinquishing our Christian role to be a check on governmental evil, and we actually participate in governmental evil. Nazi Germany is a clear example here. Instead, we should render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. That's Matthew 22:21. State authorities should get only what is due them. So let's examine some of these biblical examples a little closer, because Romans 13 is not the only place that teaches us what our relationship to the government should be. Okay, so number one, we see Paul submitting to unjustified arrests, to interrogation, to unfair beatings, and unjust imprisonment. He takes it because he's trying to make disciples for Christ. Number two, at the same time, we see John the Baptist confronting governmental evil and going to prison for it. Now, in this case, in John the Baptist's case, it was not defying a law. He was not saying we ought to obey God rather than men. John was morally rebuking what was wrong and speaking out defiantly, firmly, and morally. See, but we need to see John still stood against the government. Number three, in Acts 5:29, we see Peter and the apostles defying government. But remember, the government there and then wasn't asking Peter and John to sin, but only to shut up and submit. Do what we're telling you to do and keep your mouth closed. And that's what Peter and the apostles refused to do. Number 4, we see Daniel in Daniel chapter 1 standing up to Nebuchadnezzar himself, refusing to comply with the king's rules. Daniel 1:8 says it was because he refused to defile himself. Now in Daniel's case, it was an issue of cultic compromise because the food had been offered to idols. In Daniel, it was not so much the food that defiled, because none of the food in Babylon was kosher, as much as it was the total program of assimilation. It mattered in this case to their testimony. Babylon wanted to make them all secular. And Daniel said, no, we're not going to allow that. They resisted the king to preserve their distinct identity as people of God. So this calls for a spirit of wisdom. There are a few clean lines here, or a list to follow. We have to seek the Lord's will in these matters and walk in the Spirit. Number 5, we know that the defining act of early Christian martyrs was to defy the evil of authorities, of government, formally and face to face. No, we won't do what you're saying. And in that case, it was not necessarily, depending on the situation, we ought to obey God rather than men. It was an evil empire that was asking them to be secular. Number 6, we have not only the right, but an obligation to disobey the government when the state commands something that would be sin. Now that's different than when you think your rights have been infringed upon. Yet at the same time, we see Paul standing up to the government when his rights were being infringed upon. So this calls for a spirit of wisdom. What I'm saying is that Romans 13:1 is not the end all to all the Bible's teaching about how we interact with the government. To the extent that the government inspires terror in evildoers, this is number 7, to the extent that the government inspires terror in evildoers, it surely deserves the obedience of the Christian. Yes. But to the extent that the government inspires terror in those who do good and uses the sword to silence or intimidate them, it deserves the disobedience of Christians. Now, in case you're thinking Romans 13 doesn't say that, there are other parts of the Bible that do. For instance, if we compare Romans 13 with Revelation 13, which also pertains to how a Christian should respond to the government. We also see such a thing in Moses, where Moses defied Pharaoh and refused to do what Pharaoh was telling him to do. Let's continue with Romans 13. Romans 13:5 says, "Therefore it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also because of conscience." Yes, that's good teaching, but that's not the only biblical teaching. But, yes, these things are a matter of conscience. We have to have the wisdom and discernment to know what is right to do in each particular situation. God's wisdom will tell us when to submit, like Romans 13 tells us, and when to rise up, like we see in Moses or John the Baptist or Daniel or Peter and the apostles or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The overriding point here, the purpose, is to overcome evil with good. Now, sometimes you overcome evil with good by turning the other cheek and taking the hit. And we see Paul doing that. So we have to, but sometimes to overcome evil with good, we have to stand up and say, not anymore, not on my watch. And that's what we see in Moses, Daniel, and others. And we have to let the Spirit teach us. That's a problem, because people often find a way of blaming the Spirit for something that's just what they choose to do. And that's not how walking in the Spirit really works. We have to be open to the Spirit telling us His way, even if it's different from our way. As Americans, or Canadians, or wherever you're from, but particularly as Americans and Canadians, we're used to be wrapped up in ourselves, the way we see it and what we want. And then we claim it's God's will when it's just our will. And it's amazing how often God's will conforms to ours. And that's a problem, but that's not God's way. God's way is to seek Him first, to hear His voice, to walk in His Spirit. And that takes a whole different kind of view than using God to rubber stamp my will. Romans 13:7. We'll continue through Romans 13 because I told you that's what we're going to talk about. Give everyone what you owe him. If you owe taxes, pay your taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. John Yoder, again, in a book called The Politics of Jesus, says, quote, "We are being instructed to discriminate. Render to each what is due. Taxes and revenue, perhaps honor, are due to Caesar, but fear is due to God. We are instructed to refuse to give government certain types of honor and fear. The place of government in the providential designs of God is not such that our duty would be simply to do whatever it says." Unquote. So just by way of summary, as we examine both Paul's words and the entire Scripture, there are two extremes that are generally to be avoided. One is aggressive coercion, as if this were a theocracy. And the other is excessive accommodation, as if our testimony doesn't matter. If we're too passive, we get pushed into godless secularism. If religion just makes our faith idle, then Karl Marx was right. It's just the opiate of the masses. But if we're too aggressive, we lose the vision that we're trying to overcome evil with good, and instead we ourselves get caught up in power and our will. We use intimidation and eventually violence to compel Christian values, and we end up being the bad guys. Misguided good. Try a third time. Misguided goodness causes just as much evil as sin does. So the temptations are in both directions. Apathy and non-involvement versus trying to overpower with theocratic notions. A road less taken is the one where we engage our culture. We affirm the good things that we see. We tolerate mild shortcomings and even occasional oppression, suffering, and abuse. And yet we still oppose what is flagrantly evil or unjust. We are always working to transform culture with the grace and truth of Jesus Christ. We always advocate for the oppressed. We are always working to subvert evil. We should all be responsibly engaged in politics to increase justice, morality, compassion, security, prosperity, and freedom for all. So if you think Romans 13 is either about static apathy and blind submission that does whatever the government says, or hostile confrontation to force government to theocracy, you've really missed Paul's purpose. Let me give you a few points of what my advice would be, and I'll close with this. Number one, our primary consideration, no matter what, is obeying God in such a way that God gets glorified. Acts 5:29, we ought to obey God rather than men. The Lord's Prayer. What matters ultimately is God's will and God's kingdom. That is the guiding advice for anything we do. My advice number two, act in such a way, whatever it happens to be, so as to overcome evil with good. And that's from Romans 12:21. Now, sometimes that means turning the other cheek, as we see Jesus do in Matthew 5:39, and we see Paul do the same thing. But sometimes that means speaking out, as we see John the Baptist do in Mark 6:17 and 18, and we see Paul do it as well. Sometimes disobedience to the government as the way to do that, as we hear God telling the Magi in Matthew 2:12. And sometimes rising up against the government is the way to do that, as we see with Moses. And you may say, well, God told Moses to do that. Okay. God told Moses to do that. Sometimes that's the appropriate action to take as we listen to the Spirit. My advice number three, we are caretakers of the government. We are the stewards over it. There's a time to submit and a time to rise up. There is a time for every purpose under heaven. Our convictions and the voice of the Holy Spirit will guide us as to which to do when. But it's not like only one of those is ever a choice for us. And number four, we have a moral obligation to work for moral and just government. Romans 13:3 works both ways. The government holds us accountable, and we hold the government accountable. And John the Baptist is our example of that. So that's my teaching on Romans 13 and about a Christian's relationship to the government. If you want to discuss that with me, put it in the comments below. I will interact with you in the comments below. There's a whole lot more to talk about than what I've said, but this will get the conversation going. Thanks for tuning in.